A China Eastern Airbus A320 had just been cleared to take off. Halfway down the runway, an Airbus A330 had also been cleared to cross the runway. To see what happens next and why, stay tuned. This is the story of China Eastern Flight MU5643, an Airbus A320 that was operating out of Shanghai Hongqiao Airport. Now, the date was the 11th of October 2016, and the aircraft was due to fly to Tianjin Airport in China. There were 147 passengers on board and 10 crew. For those of you that haven't heard about China Eastern Airlines, it's considered one of the big three airlines in China, alongside Air China and China Southern Airlines. The other aircraft involved was another China Eastern Airbus A330. This was flight MU5106, and there were 266 passengers on board and 16 crew. The aircraft was flying from Beijing to Shanghai Qiao Airport. The China Eastern A320 had been cleared startup and cleared to taxi to the taxi holding point Hotel 7 for runway 36 left. At the same time, the China Eastern Airbus A330 was on its approach for runway 36 right.
300.
The structure of Shanghai Qiao Airport, it has parallel runways, 36 left and 36 right. The A330 then continued its approach and landed on 36 right, informing the tower that they were going to exit the runway at Hotel 4, looking to taxi back to the main terminal on the west side of the airport, which required the aircraft to cross runway 36 left. If you're enjoying the content of the channel, please do consider subscribing. Currently, over 99% of my viewers aren't subscribed, and it would help me out so much if you did consider subscribing or liking the video. At this point, the A320 that was at the taxi holding point for 36 left received its takeoff clearance, and it was clear to take off from 36 left. The way it works at Shanghai Airport is each runway has a specific controller on a different frequency. So as the A330 that landed on 36 right was on a different frequency, it didn't hear the takeoff clearance that the A320 had received. At this point, the A330 was handed over to the controller handling runway 36 left, and they were told to hold short of runway 36 left. At this point, the tower controller needed a bathroom break, so the assistant controller, who was fully qualified to work as a tower controller, then took over control of the situation. However, it was noted that a proper handover didn't take place between the two controllers. The assistant controller also stayed in their seat, which was lower down than the other controller seat, and from where they were sitting, they had a obstructed view of the southern edge of runway 36 left. The southern edge being the end where the A320 was in its takeoff roll. At this point, the A330 was then given clearance to cross runway 36 left. This was 7 seconds after it had received its instruction to hold short of runway 36 left. The crew of the A330 had noted that they saw the A320 at the southern edge of runway 36 left. However, at the same time, they heard several ready for departure calls, with the tower responding with Roger, not providing takeoff instructions. They then assumed that the A320 was waiting its takeoff clearance and then proceeded to cross the runway. At this point, the assistant tower controller was having issues with their radio and turned around and started talking to the other controllers, querying if they had similar issues with their radios. The A320 crew, that were now in the middle of a takeoff, were focused on their aircraft, with one pilot heads in, looking at the aircraft instruments and indications, and the other pilot, which was the pilot flying, looking out and carrying out the takeoff. The pilot flying, who was the first officer, then recognized that the A330 looked as if it may enter the runway. The aircraft was doing 143 knots, which was 5 knots less than the V1 speed. V1 being their decision speed. Once the aircraft passes that speed, you are then committed to the takeoff, as the stopping distance remaining isn't enough to bring the aircraft to a stop at that point. The observer in the A320 then immediately inquired with the tower, and then the tower told the A330 to hold position twice without receiving a response from them. The A330 that was now already on the runway ignored these instructions and continued to complete the runway crossing. Up until this point, the crew of the A330 had not carried out a continuous, effective visual observation whilst crossing runway 36 left. They still assumed that the aircraft had not received takeoff clearance yet. The first officer of the A320 in the takeoff role had now reached 149 knots, which was the rotate speed. He then pulled the side stick back, causing the nose to pitch up, and applied the brakes. 2 seconds later, he then released the pressure on the side stick, and the nose wheel touched back down on the runway. The aircraft was now only 590 meters away from the A330, and the crew were now confident that the A330 was on the runway in front of them. Seeing that the first officer had hesitated to take action, the captain of the A320 then took control. The speed now was well above V1 and V-rotate. He then pulled the side stick as far back as it would physically go, pushed the thrust levers into takeoff go-around detent. At the same time, the first officer pulled back on his side stick, which triggered a dual input warning. Then, about 250 meters before the intersection, the main wheels of the aircraft became airborne. The aircraft started to climb, and it cleared the A330 on the runway by 19 meters. The A330 then continued its crossing and taxied to the terminal as normal on the western side of the airport. The assistant controller in the tower was still focused on his radio issues and left his seat to get his radio replaced. He was not aware of the near miss that had just occurred for the two aircraft he was just controlling. The assigned tower controller then returned from his bathroom break, returned to his seat, and remained unaware of the runway incursion. The crew of the A330 then reported the incident immediately. However, it is noted that they did not realise the severity of the occurrence at the time. This prompted the tower controller to report the incident to their supervisor, but again it was 3 hours later where they reviewed the radar surveillance video and realised the severity of the runway incursion, and at this point they reported the occurrence to their superior department. The crew of the A320 continued their flight to Tianjin Airport and only submitted their report after landing. Now, I've labelled this section the consequences of the event, as the actions that were carried out after are a little different than what we're used to seeing. China's Civil Aviation Authority, the CAAC, then carried out the investigation of this event. Due to their findings, they then announced that the tower controller in charge, as well as the supervisor, had their licenses revoked for life, and they are not permitted ever again to take a controller position or a supervisory role. They also fired or reprimanded 13 of their East China regional administration offices, as they indicated there were systemic issues involved and more people than just the two controllers in charge at the time were at fault. They also pointed the blame of the crew of the A330, who failed to check the runway for any traffic before crossing. Now, the reason this is a bit of a shame is because in aviation it operates under a safety culture, also known as just culture. And for this to work, personnel are encouraged to report safety-related information without fear of punishment, except for obviously cases of gross negligence. But by promoting this culture, it creates an industry that learns from the faults that have caused accidents in the past and also ensure that they do not occur again. You could argue that one of the controllers in this incident was negligent towards their duties, especially after the A320 had reported that there may be an aircraft crossing the runway, and then he told them to hold position and carried on dealing with his own problem. However, out of this incident, many lessons could be learned to make the operations not just at Shanghai Airport better, but other airports as well. The obvious example being that an effective handover between controllers takes place, and for the instance of this one in particular, that the controller in the assistant seat, if they're going to take over the role of the main controller, they need to move seats so they can observe the airfield better. Also, the crew of the A330 could receive some extra training with runway crossings, and the crew of the A320, although ultimately they saved everybody's lives here. The first officer, for example, was quite hesitant in his actions, and some extra training for the entire airline would be beneficial to make more decisive decisions in the future. The captain of the A320, however, did act decisively and did save the lives of all 439 people. Without that split-second decision-making, this could have been a catastrophic disaster. If you're interested in finding out more about some other air accident investigations, just click on the cards now. I also have a playlist which summarises all of the air crash investigations and air accident investigations that I do on this channel. And please do, if you liked what you saw, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can be the first to find out when I put a new video up. But that's all we have for this one. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.